Hello, everybody. Welcome to my Come Follow Me live presentation. My name is Dan McClellan. I'm going to be with you for the next little bit, and I don't know if you're going to be able to engage with me or not on this live broadcast, but if you would like to, you're more than welcome. And I'd love to get some questions and some feedback and answer what I can. Like I said, my name is Dan McClellan. I am a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I've been doing this for about the last 7 years. I'm also finishing up my PhD right now in theology and religion. I'm writing a dissertation on the conceptualization of deity in the Hebrew Bible. And I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about the Come Follow Me curriculum, a little bit about the rationale for it, and how we've worked to put it together, and then give some talk a little bit about how working in scripture translation has informed my own scripture study and some of the insights I've drawn from that I believe can help some of you to improve your own scripture study and get more out of the Come Follow Me program. Now, I was not involved with the creation of the Come Follow Me curriculum, but I do know a little bit about the origins. One of the main things it was intended to do was to unify the different curricula that were going on across the different organizations that the church has, so that primary and young men and gospel doctrine were going through the same, at least working on the same passages of text, and they were able to see what each other was doing. And but it was also intended to kind of shift the burden of study off of the teachers and onto the students, which is where the Individuals and Families Manual came from. This was an opportunity to give the students some at-home work to do, so that instructors were not required to kind of bear the entire burden of teaching the class, but be more like discussion leaders. And so I think that has been, the degree to which that has been successful differs from unit to unit. I know that some people have absolutely loved it. A lot of families have committed to it entirely and are getting into the scriptures in ways that they haven't before. And I think that's wonderful. I think there's still ways that we can improve on it. There are, we are constantly talking about what we can do in the next manuals to make them better and to help guide the student into getting more insight out of the scriptures, into feeling the Spirit more with the scriptures. And I'll talk in a little bit about precisely that, what our goals are for scripture study. And one of the other things that they wanted to do with Come Follow Me was create something, create a manual that had more of a global audience in mind. And so it is, we've expanded the number of languages that the manual is translated into. And the writers always try to keep in mind that they're writing for a global audience. So it's not just people along the Wasatch Front. It's people in the tiny little isles of the sea and in far-flung places of the world that a lot of us, these places are not in the front of our mind when we think about church membership and scripture study. But the curriculum writers have really tried to bring it there so that they can craft these manuals to best serve their interests, and that's something that I feel like I have learned a lot about over the years as a scripture translation supervisor. I get to travel out to a lot of places where the church is that I've never been before. I was an adult convert to the church. I joined when I was 20. I went on a mission a year later, served in Uruguay. So I actually, by the time I returned, I had been a Spanish-speaking member of the church in South America longer than I had been a member of the church in the United States. So I kind of developed my gospel knowledge in a Spanish context. So sometimes there are still Spanish words that I think make more sense to me than than English ones. And so the curriculum writers are trying to create manuals that will be useful to people who live in much different sociocultural contexts than we do here along the Wasatch Front. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can get more out of that study, because there's not the manuals are not they're not designed to answer all the questions that a student might have about the scriptures. Really, they're designed to provide a few doctrinal points that the curriculum writers have drawn from the segments of text that they're looking at. But really, the goal is to help the student get into the scriptures and do the study for themselves. And I found that one of the things that helps us more than anything else is having the desire to get in there. And an obstacle that I see a lot of times is the assumption that a student already knows basically what they're going to find in the scriptures. I know I have felt that way before reading the Book of Mormon. I already know the narrative, I know the characters, I know everything that's going to happen. And so sometimes we can get a little glassy-eyed and just kind of go through the motions. And I think that impedes our growth when we think that we already know everything that's in there in the scriptures. If everyone had the opportunity to go through a scripture translation project and sit down with translators and wrestle with the text with them as they say, what precisely does this mean? Because our language doesn't have this word or doesn't have the exact same concept that we have in English. We need to choose between these two different options. How do we do that? If everyone had an opportunity to sit down with a team and discuss the scriptures at that level, I think they would have a newfound respect for and awe of everything that is in the scriptures, the different levels on which they function. And so one of the things that I've a little trick that I've seen used by a number of people who I think are very good students of the scriptures is to translate them yourself. Now, maybe not into another language. I imagine most of you don't speak other additional languages natively. And so what I mean is just translate it into your own words in English. And this is not to say something that you put online and say, this is my paraphrase of the Book of Mormon. That's not something the church wants us to do, but I don't think it's inappropriate for us to put into our own words for our own benefit what we understand the scriptures to mean. And if you go through and pick some passages and try to figure that out, if I have to put this into another, say it in another way, but so that it has the same meaning, I think we can come to appreciate just how rich the scriptures are, because you're going to find it's very difficult in many places, and particularly when it comes time to decide if there's a word in the scriptures that can have multiple different meanings. A lot of times we'll gloss right over that. But in a language where you have to choose between one of those, or if you're trying to rephrase it in English and you cannot use the same multivalent word, but you have to pick something more specific, I think you'd be surprised at how difficult that can be and how much it compels us to understand the scriptures in much greater detail. So that's one trick that you can use to help you really discover the depth and the complexity of the scriptures, so that every time you approach them, it is not just to rehash the same experience you've had 100 times, but to find something new in there. And I think more than anything else, what the leaders of the church want us to find in the scriptures is to learn doctrine that changes behavior. And so if we are there to change ourselves, I think we can't do that by just understanding it the same way over and over and again. We have to come to new understandings of the scriptures. And another principle that I always promote when I'm talking to people about how to improve their scripture study is to be clear about why you're studying. A lot of people don't think about the purpose of scripture study, but Many people read the scriptures because they want to commune with the Spirit. Some people read the scriptures because they want to better understand the narrative or the history, or to be able to have and get a better grasp on what's going on in the story. Sometimes people read the scriptures to remember, to help remind themselves of what's going on in these stories about God's dealings with his people. Sometimes we are reading the scriptures because we have a question that we want to find an answer to, and so we go to a specific portion of the scriptures where we know that concept is dealt with. Sometimes we might be reading the scriptures because we want to know more about a specific doctrinal principle. We do a topical study. If we know precisely what our goal is for a scripture study session, that can help us to pick the methodologies and the approaches that are going to most effectively help us reach that goal. And so if you're reading to commune with the Spirit, I think it's not incredibly important that you pick a specific section of the Book of Mormon, the New Testament, the Pearl of Great Price, whatever you're reading. There are probably some things you might want to avoid. The war chapters in Alma were never very effective for me when I'm trying to approach the scriptures just to commune with the Spirit. So have a goal in mind. Another thing that is always helpful is to think about the intentions of the author. We tend to sometimes think of all the scriptures as just kind of the same text. We can cross authorial boundaries. We can even cross boundaries between different books, and we tend to conceptualize it as the same kind of mass of inspired text. In reality, every single word of the scriptures was written by a human being who was compelled by some goal, some rhetorical goal. They wanted the text to serve a function. And so if we think about the intentions of the authors, that can help us better understand precisely what they wanted the text to do, and we can pay better attention to those indicators. The Book of Mormon is actually quite good at having the authors tell us, this is why I'm writing. The title page has Moroni explain exactly what the broader collection that is the Book of Mormon, what is it intended to do. But the authors also say, this is why I've written, and they're not always written for the same reason. But if we pay attention to the reason, and then try to read everything through that framework, through those lenses of how does this accomplish that goal, it helps us to focus on the most important stuff, and it helps us to contextualize it within that rhetorical goal. And I think that helps us to align our scripture study with the purposes of the author. Like I said, in the Book of Mormon, that tends to be much more explicit than with other texts. The Bible is a bit different, and we have different clues that we use to try and figure out what the authors are trying to do. Probably my favorite clue is genre. Genre is not something that we talk about a lot in the church, but we're trying to help the curriculum writers find ways to include genre in their discussions. And I think they're working on the Old Testament manual right now. There will be some discussions about genre and how about understanding how the authors wanted the text to function and how they used specific literary conventions in order to facilitate that function. Can help us better understand the scriptures. So we have in the Psalms, there are a bunch of different genres that are used. The Gospels are a specific type of genre, a unique type of genre. There's still discussion about what were the genres that the Gospel authors initially drew from in order to put together this new genre called the Gospel. Because better understanding where those conventions came from can help us better understand what they were trying to achieve. And a lot of this goes on, is not conscious. A lot of this is subconscious. It's intuitive. If you found a piece of paper on the ground and it said a dozen eggs, pound of ground beef, cereal, Worcestershire sauce, we would know exactly what that text is. It's a grocery list, and we would know exactly what it is intended for, how it was supposed to be used, precisely because we can categorize its genre. Now, if we changed what was on that scrap of paper, the list, to 2 eggs, a teaspoon of salt, whatever, we know this is a different genre. This is a recipe. And now we know that this text is intended to be used for an entirely different purpose. If a story starts off once upon a time, that's a signal that this is a specific kind of story. And this is going to, there's a specific goal in mind. If it starts off, it was a dark and stormy night, it's a completely different genre, and we expect different things out of the story. Now, authors can also use those, and they can flip the script, and they can play with the reader's expectations of what's going to happen. And that happens in the scriptures as well. Jonah, for instance, is a book that takes the prophetic genre and then flips it over. It says, here's the anti-prophet. Here's somebody who did everything opposite of what the standard prophet would do. And there was a reason they were doing that. But if we can consider genre and think about what the author wanted this text to do, it can help us find different questions to ask of the text. The most important thing about learning from studying the scriptures is to ask questions of the text and then find the answers. And that's why in the Come Follow Me manuals, you find a lot of questions that are in there. And there is not parenthetical answers provided like there used to be in many of the manuals, because they want the reader to go in and ask the questions and find their own answers. And the answers are not always going to be the same, but that's okay. That's what they want the reader to do, is go find their own answers. One other principle is to be aware of the lenses that we bring to the text. No texts have inherent meaning. The meaning is all produced in our head as we read. Now, everybody knows the rules of language well enough to be able to comprehend more or less what's going on, but misunderstanding still occurs all the time when two people are speaking. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has misunderstood my wife, and I'm sure I'm not the only husband who's been misunderstood by a wife, and that's just because language is not that precise. There's actually a lot of gray area in how language works. And in our heads, we're trying to put together, based on our understanding of the rules and the conventions and the context and what their intentions are, trying to put together the most likely meaning. And the same is true of reading texts. And we have our own lenses that we look through where we expect certain things of the text. And so we basically create a framework or a skeleton, and then we use what the text says to add the flesh to that skeleton, so to speak, to create what we imagine the meaning to be. And a lot of times what we expect has a significant influence on the meaning that we discover in there. And so our lenses, the sociocultural lenses that we have, can greatly influence what kind of meaning we get out of the text. An example is, and I recently published I don't think I have a copy with me, in not the most recent issue of The Religious Educator, but the previous one. I published a paper on Bible translation in the church. And one of the things I discussed was a ministering message from last July 2018, that quoted a passage in the book of Jude in the New Testament, Jude 1:22. Which says, and of some have compassion, making a difference. And the message uses this passage of scripture to, it says, as you minister as Christ would with compassion, you will find you can make a difference in people's lives, which is a wonderful message. But that's not what the scripture actually means. And the reason that the scripture was misunderstood was because the people who wrote that ministering message were looking at it through a 21st century Americans' eyes. Making a difference when the King James Bible was translated did not mean having an influence, a positive influence on someone. That meaning did not develop until the early 20th century. When the King James Bible was translated, what that meant was to exercise discernment or distinguish between. So really the text was saying, of some have compassion, but exercise discernment regarding on whom. And so because the people who wrote the ministering message were thinking with 21st century American were looking at it through 21st century American lenses, they weren't thinking about this as a text from the 17th century that had a 17th century understanding of this phrase. They just assumed that the understanding that they had from the 21st century matched the understanding from the 17th century. And so we run into issues like that all the time when we don't consider that we are looking through all these texts through lenses that we've developed through our experiences with language, with scripture, in the church, with the world around us. And so the more we're able to think about how did the world in which this author lived differ from the one in which I lived, the more we can approximate what those authors were intended for this text to do and how they intended for their readers to respond to it. So I think with those principles in mind, hopefully what that can do is make the scriptures a little harder for us. It can hopefully make it so that we realize we don't understand them as well as we often think we do. And also make us realize that there's a lot more in them for us to discover than we normally recognize. And hopefully it will help us recognize that as we discover those new things, we're going to learn new things. We're not going to discover all the stuff we already knew. We're going to discover new things. It's going to change the way we think about the gospel, our relationship to God, our relationship to the people around us, the function of the atonement in our lives, our relationship with Jesus Christ. And hopefully that will help lead us to changing behavior, to more deeper, meaningful scripture study, to better relationships with those around us. So I know that I can make this sound kind of academic sometimes. I still have to work on that, my wife tells me, but hopefully those principles can help us get more out of Come Follow Me, so that we're not relying as much on the manual, but so that we see that in this program there's an opportunity for us to take the responsibility on ourselves for the scripture study, so that when we go into class, I've been in a lot of gospel doctrine classes where the teacher says, okay, so what did we all read last week? And nobody raises their hand. And then they basically have to go through and teach the lesson exactly as they would have 2 or 3 years ago, by going over all the things that are discussed in the manual and asking all the questions directly to the class and getting all the standard answers from them. And that's not a phenomenally edifying experience for most of those involved, but I think we can do better. And I think there's a lot of doctrine in the scriptures for us to learn that can change our behavior. So that was the presentation that I had to offer, and I'm not entirely familiar with this format. I see we have a few people on. If there's anyone who has any questions or comments or chistes or chismes, I'd be happy to respond to them. Or if there's nothing else, then I will go see why my children are tearing the house apart. I see Mark is here, Neil is here, Tariq is here, or at some point we're here. It doesn't look like there's any engagement going on right now, so I will sign off then, and hopefully there will be some engagement in the future as this video gets posted. And if anybody has any questions or concerns, wants to know a little bit more about Come Follow Me and how it was intended to be used, or how we are working on the future manuals, the Book of Mormon one is already out. The Doctrine and Covenants manual has been completed, and that will it's in production, and so that will come out later next year. And we are currently writing the Old Testament manual as we speak. And so a lot of great questions coming up, a lot of concern about how to craft this manual and reframe it so that people can be equipped to make the most out of the Old Testament, because I think a lot of people are worried about making that a successful come follow me curriculum in light of how messy the Old Testament can be sometimes, and how much guidance and hand-holding sometimes students need, because there's not a lot of space for that in the manual. Thank you for your time, everybody. I appreciate everybody who was able to join us, and I will be following the post. So if you want to engage there, I'll be happy to respond to your questions or concerns. So hope everybody has a good night.